Let's explore this in a bit more detail. Clinton Shamakamba is a carbon projects developer at EcoSecurities. He's joining us from Lusaka, Zambia's capital. Clinton, thank you very much for your time this evening. So let's start with setting the parameters of the conversation. Can you give us a sense of what the size of the total addressable market for carbon credits coming out of Africa is like?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, starting the invent of carbon credit markets in Africa, Africa has gotten out 313 million credits, which only account for about 13% of all the world's the global credits that have been generated from carbon projects. But now, as we stand with the invent of renewable energy technology, Africa has the potential to fill the needs of 7,000 million watts of renewable energy through carbon projects in renewable energy. And by virtue of our position in Africa, close to the equator, we have about 11 megawatts, terawatts, in fact, of solar energy that has not been tapped. And so that's a great potential that exists to generate carbon credits from renewable energy.
What's the current problem with the way the market is structured? Because all these governments are saying we need a bit more money to come back and stay in the continent. So when a trade is done on these emissions, is it that the capital essentially, most of it anyway, essentially goes out of the countries in which these carbon credits are being generated?
Well, yes, there have been issues of transparency in how transactions are conducted in carbon projects. And because the finance really goes to other countries, and this has been created because there's been no regulation policies that are framed around carbon trading in most of these African countries. And so the issue of transparency has come because how much goes to the communities and how much goes to the governments where these carbon credits are generated hasn't come forth. So there's an opportunity now. I think the clarion call has been from this African Voluntary Carbon Credit Market Forum that Africa needs to domesticate these credits now and actually see the benefit from them.
So these credits that we're talking about, will they be compatible with the EU's emission trading system? And just as important, to go back to something that you mentioned here, quantification and verification of these emission offsets. How will that be done? Will that be standardized?
Well, the European Union emissions trading system, now with countries that are subscribed to the Paris Agreement, about 190 countries, which the European countries are also part of this, like Switzerland and other countries. The Paris Agreement in Article 6.2 allows for trading of emissions reductions from African carbon projects. And so provided that these countries apply corresponding adjustments so that there is no double counting of these emissions reductions or carbon credits, or emissions removals, that these projects in Africa still have an opportunity to trade on the international market. And the political situation between countries, for example, the bilateral agreements are what will qualify African projects. And we see just recently Ghana is leading in this effort because they have done their Article 6 implementation framework, in which they are trading with Switzerland. And so there is an opportunity to trade African generated carbon credits even to the EU market. And there are carbon exchanges that allow for such transactions to happen. But bear in mind that these carbon credits then become internationally traded mitigation outcomes for countries to manage their ambitions on nationally determined contributions.
All right, then one last question for you. The last year, right, at COP27, the African Carbon Markets Initiative was also announced. Does this plan merge into that, or is this an entirely separate endeavor?
Well, this initiative mainly allows for transparency and locking in climate finance into African countries. So it speaks to that, but largely now the interpretation of most of these African countries, as you can see, just as you spoke about policy framework being around, for example, in sub-Saharan countries, around the governments getting a share of this credit. So they want to lock in the markets by creating their own registries which is a good thing. And I think there's huge potential with this initiative of the Africa Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative.